Well, there's a question that was asked of Jesus when he was on trial before Pilate. And Pilate had spent some time talking with the Jewish leaders, and he's trying to figure out, okay, why is it that you want to kill this guy? And they don't have really a great answer, and he's frustrated with them, and he's like, why is it really? And they say, well, he just, he thinks he's a king. And so Jesus and Pilate have this conversation. Pilate comes back into the palace, and he summons Jesus, and he says, Are you the king of the Jews? I love this question, and it's where we're going this morning as we continue into this series called King. And in this series, we're trying to explore the concept of king, which is a concept we've really become disconnected with. And I'm fascinated with this story of Jesus becoming a king because it really all started many, many years ago with a king that just didn't really work out that well. Over the last few weeks, we have been proceeding in the story, following God's people as they made this covenant with him in the wilderness. And then he brings them into the promised land, and they totally screw it up. And they keep waging war with the people, and the people keep waging war with them. And finally they say, we need a king. We need someone who will go before us. And last week, Paul talked to us about how when Samuel, the prophet of God, came before God, and he said, the people are asking for a king. And God says, be sure to tell them that if they have a king, he's going to take their daughters into service in this way, and he's going to take their sons into service this way. He's going to have new taxes and new laws. Essentially, what God was trying to tell the people is this: your freedom that I came to bring you to this place, your freedom will be less with a human king. But they cry out and they say, but we want a king anyway. Hey guys, back there in the tech booth, if I could, I'm just going to ask you, if you will, to change this slide right here to be what's on this screen. Just want to pause for a minute. And if y'all are able to do that, that would be really helpful. Yes, thank you so very much, because I want to make sure that y'all get some of this, because we're going to move through this story of Saul this morning. Saul is the king, is the first king of Israel. And Saul steps onto the pages of history as Samuel goes before God, and he says the people want a king, and God says, give them a king. And so Saul steps out. Saul, the son of Kish, is out looking for his father's donkeys. He's not a king yet. He's just somebody who's out there doing the chores that his father sends him to do. And as he's out looking for these donkeys for 3 days, he can't find them anywhere. And so he asks his servant, what are we supposed to do? We can't find the donkeys. My dad's going to be asking about me. Let's go back home. And the servant says, well, maybe we should go see this prophet Samuel. And so they go see this prophet Samuel, and they get more than they bargained for. In fact, the night before, God had told Samuel, a man's going to come meet you, and I want you to anoint him as king. And so the next day, when Saul comes in and he meets Samuel, Samuel tells him this: Saul, go up ahead of me to the high place, for today you're going to eat with me. In the morning, I will send you on your way and will tell you all that is in your heart. And Saul's like, I don't need to know that. I'm just looking for some donkeys. And Samuel, with this kind of Jedi mind trick thing, says, well, as for the donkeys that you lost 3 days ago, don't worry about them. They've been found. Oh, and Saul, to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and to your whole family line? Now, it was the talk of the town at this point that Samuel was supposed to be out looking for a king. And so it's no surprise to Saul that what Samuel's hinting at is, hey, you're going to be the guy. And here's where we get to see Saul for the first time. Really, truly, what's in his heart. And I'm actually pleased to tell you, it actually has a really humble beginning. Saul responds to Samuel, and he says this: but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? I mean, I'm from the smallest tribe. You know how brothers are, and that's descended from generations to generation. I'm the least of my brothers. And you remember Benjamin, back from the story of Judges. I mean, all of Israel turned against us because of our wickedness. I mean, we're kind of from a wicked tribe, and we're the smallest tribe. And on top of that, isn't my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say these things to me? Why are you saying this to me? So that's kind of the question that we have this morning is, why did God choose Saul to be Israel's first king? Saul himself seemed to be a little bit confused. Why are you coming to talk to me? Who am I? And so the question is, why did God choose Saul to be Israel's first king? This question becomes even more perplexing when we fast forward to the ending of Samuel and Saul's relationship. Because near the end of their relationship, while it started with humble beginnings, is actually quite a horrible ending. In Samuel chapter 15, it says, "Until the day Samuel died, he did not go see Saul again, though he mourned for him." This was a pretty bad breakup. They're not even on talking terms. And more than that, this is how God feels about Saul. It says, "And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel." Some translations say, the Lord grieved that he made Saul king. Isn't that fascinating? The Lord regretting that he did something? The Lord grieving that he did something? And so whether you grew up reading the Bible or not, or you're familiar with this story or not, you may be wondering a similar thing that I was wondering as well, which is this. Did God make a mistake? Did God make a mistake? And on one hand, if you have a personal relationship with Jesus and you know the Lord, you're like, surely not. But why then did God make Saul the first king? And the answer is that God gave the people what they wanted. When Samuel was introducing Saul to the people for the first time, this is what he said. "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." There's no one like him. He's a head taller. He's better looking. He's stronger. I mean, look at him when he walks in the room. He's so much bigger than everybody else. And I can tell you this, being someone who's generally a little bit taller than most people, that's not a sure guarantee of being successful. The story of Saul is this, and this is really, you got to get this right up front. This is so important. This is the story of what happens when God gives us the king we think we want. This is the story of what happens and the results of when we have the kind of king we think that we want. And it ends with the Lord regretting that he had made Saul king over Israel. Now, you and I, we don't have the influence of kings, right? And yet, there's a part of me that reads this and tries to put myself into this and think, can I imagine? What would it be like for God to regret him putting me into any kind of position of responsibility? Can you imagine if the Lord said about you, or if it was true about you, that the Lord regretted that he had made you a teacher? Can you imagine the Lord regretting making you a manager, responsible for other people, making you an employer, making you an older brother or an older sister, someone who's responsible for their siblings, responsible for caring for them? Can you imagine, just seriously for 1 minute, pay attention, can you imagine the Lord regretting that he made you a parent? The Israelites had to learn the hard way, but we have the story. And so the question that I want to ask this morning as we transition into the story of Saul is this, is how, with this regret and this grieving, how do we avoid it? How do we avoid being in a situation where we will look back and know that the Lord regretted or grieved having put us in that position? And so today, as we get into the story, I'd like to submit to you that there are 3 promises, 3 self-promises, that if Saul had made these promises to himself, it would have changed the course of history. And you're thinking, yeah, well, if I made those promises, it wouldn't change the course of history. No, but it would. It would change the course of history for someone. 3 promises to avoid regret. So shortly after Samuel confirmed Saul as being king, Saul did what he was supposed to do. The people cried out and they said, "We want a king who will go before us into battle." And so Saul goes and he picks a fight with their enemies, chiefly among them the Philistines. And as he was instructed by Samuel to do, he was to wait for 7 days for Samuel to arrive and to bless this battle, to make a sacrifice to the Lord, to invite his blessing over this battle, and to instruct Saul what to do. So he picks a fight with the Philistines, and he waits. And as he's waiting, the Philistines get pretty ticked off. It says the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Now, the Philistines were so much more advanced than those in Israel. They had chariots. They had, people riding those chariots. They had so many more soldiers. They had weapons unlike the Israelites had. And they lived out on the coastal plains, and they were the barrier for Israel to actually begin to take over the land that God had promised them. And so as the Israelite army is seeing the Philistines assembling, this is what it says. It says, when the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they did exactly what you'd imagine that they would do, and probably what I would have done too. They hid in caves, in thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. We got to get out of here. We've made a big mistake. The author of this story actually tells us something even more shameful than hiding. It says that some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. They even crossed over back where they had originally crossed over into the land to fight at this battle of Jericho. They now cross back over. We're going backwards. We're getting out of here. We have made a huge mistake. And it's at this point that Saul looks out and he sees his enemy's army mounting and getting larger and larger day by day as they're coming to take over Israel. And he looks and he sees his own men scattering and hiding and even fleeing the country. And he looks down the road, and Samuel still hasn't come. And so Saul actually steps outside the parameters that God had laid out for him. And he takes this sacrifice that was not his to sacrifice, but it was Samuel's. And he offers it up to the Lord, which to you and I may not seem like a big deal, but this was the first act of disobedience that Saul committed. And this is the beginning of a pattern where we see that Saul feared men more than he feared God. And right on cue, Samuel shows up. And he says to Saul, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord God gave you." It was so clear. This was your one thing. This was a big moment. The entire army of the Philistines was here. All you had to do was just wait until I showed up. I was going to sacrifice this. That's all you had to do. And God would have done an amazing thing. And you wouldn't have spent the rest of your life fighting. He says this, if you had, not only that, if you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. Now, Saul, you don't know this really, but it would have been your line, Saul, that the Son of God, Jesus the Messiah, would have been born into. It would have been your line that Jesus, the salvation of the world, would have been born into if you had just kept the command. Samuel continues, he says, "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." And this is where we find our first promise, that if only Saul had committed this promise to himself, then God would have worked a wonderful miracle through him. This is promise number one, and this is what I would invite you to make to yourself to avoid a life of regret. I will not fear the consequences of obeying God. I will not fear the consequences of obeying God. Sure, there's consequences. People may leave you. You may be the only one standing there. But I will not fear the consequences of obeying God more than the consequences of not being liked. I will not fear the consequences of obeying God more than the consequences of not being liked, because we have this strong desire. If I'm not liked, if I'm not accepted, if I'm not included in that, then I'm by myself. But it's when we fear these consequences more than these consequences, when we fear the consequences of not being liked more than we fear the consequences of obeying God, that we develop and we create a life of regret. So Saul makes this big mistake. And he counts his men, those that are left, and he's only got 600. It's 600 against the soldiers as numerous as those on the seashore, sand on the seashore. And so Saul retreats and he backs up, and it's time to regroup. But we got to figure out what we're going to do. Meanwhile, the Philistines, brilliant, they decide to go in. They send raiding parties into Israel, and they remove all of the blacksmiths from Israel, saying, well, if they can't make weapons, they can't fight. And so the Philistines have successfully prevented Israel from being able to even challenge them in battle. So Saul and his men, they gather, and they have to go out to the battle lines with farm equipment. They're going out there with pitchforks, like hillbillies, and axes. And they're going out there, and everybody's sitting there thinking, I've got a pitchfork, and they've got a spear and a chariot and a sword. And the only people on Israel's side who had a sword and a spear were Saul and his son Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, thankfully, was pretty wise, and he looked at this and was like, this is not going to work. So Jonathan goes rogue. He goes AWOL. He decides he's going to go on a little mission of his own without telling his daddy. And he and his armor bearer go off, and they pick off this Philistine outpost. It's pretty fascinating because it says in the first attack, Jonathan, his armor bearer, killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. I mean, Jonathan totally goes nuts on these guys. And what it does is it starts a chain reaction of fear among the Philistines. They don't know what's going on. This is kind of like guerrilla warfare. This isn't the rules of how war is supposed to happen. Jonathan picks them off. Then a panic struck the whole army. Those in the camp in the field and those in the outpost and raiding parties, all of them, the ground shook, and it was a panic sent by God. So here we have Jonathan, his armor bearer, and they set off this chain reaction, and the Lord feeds it because he blesses Jonathan. And it throws their army into total chaos. Now Saul, who doesn't know what's happened, doesn't know where Jonathan is, and doesn't know what's going on, gets some of his men and he goes down to the battle line. And he's looking out over the Philistines, and he's seeing them in total chaos. They're killing themselves. And Saul decides he's going to seize the moment for himself. He doesn't know that Jonathan has picked them off. He doesn't know what God is doing, and he doesn't really even understand why the Philistines are killing themselves. So far, Saul's done nothing. And yet, he seizes the moment to take the credit for himself. And he says this. He puts his men under this oath. And he says this. He says, "Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." Now what he's saying is, cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes. Anyone that eats any of this plunder from the battle that we're about to go into and tries to take credit for that before I take full credit, cursed be him before I have avenged myself on my enemies. And you want to pause here and just say, Saul, whose fight is this? Saul, whose mission is this? They go in and they fight the battle, and Israel wins. They drive the Philistines back to the next town. And they all come together that night. Well, Jonathan, who wasn't present when his father made this oath, actually eats a little bit of honey. And Saul learns that somebody has eaten something before he had avenged himself. He doesn't know that it's Jonathan, and so they cast lots. And he doubles down on his oath, and he says this: "As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. Nobody's getting credit except for me." And they cast lots, and of course Jonathan is taken. And not only has he doubled down on his oath, but he now makes a vow before the Lord. And he says this: to his own son, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan. I mean, can you imagine? This is where we see his desire for power and his desire for credit has totally destroyed him. He's delusional. Thankfully, his men speak up. They say, should Jonathan die? He who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? It wasn't you, Saul. It was your son. Never, they cry. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. You want to take his head? We're not even going to let you give him a haircut. He is the one who did this with God's help, not you. Saul retreats. And he misses his second opportunity to go in and to finally destroy the Philistines from which God had told him to do that. And it says that all the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines. All the days there was bitter war. Saul missed his opportunity for peace. Saul missed his opportunity to have a legacy of being the one who rescued Israel, and yet his desire for power overtook him. And it didn't just affect him, because anytime he saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. Saul's desire for power cost Israel peace. And here is where the second promise emerges. And this is a promise that I'm inviting you to make to yourself today, to avoid a lifetime of regret. Promise number 2 is this: I will not value being in control more than I value being in relationship. I will not value being in control, being the one who is always right, being the one whose way is always the one that it goes that way, more than I value being in relationship. Well, the rest of Saul's days are spent in war with the Philistines. And yet the Lord hasn't completely given up on Saul. Thankfully, the Lord shows his kindness to those who don't deserve it, which is really good news. And God gives Saul another chance. And through Samuel, he gives Saul a message and he says, I want you to go and I want you to wipe out the Amalekite people. These are people who are wicked and sacrifice their own children just to have a good harvest. These are people who have tormented Israel, my children, and I want you to go and completely destroy them. So Saul goes and he actually fights the battle, and yet he doesn't carry out the commands that the Lord told him to the letter of the law. He doesn't carry it out completely. In fact, after the battle, he brings back some of the sheep and the cattle from the plunder. He brings back the king who he was supposed to kill. And Saul then goes and he sets up a monument in his own honor to say, look what I have done to the Amalekites. I've embarrassed them. I've brought back their king. I, Saul, taking credit for this. Samuel comes to Saul, and Saul says to him, the Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions. Which if you're a parent, you know this is basically an admission of guilt right here. The Lord bless you. I've carried it out. I've done it. So what do you got for me, Sam? Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep I hear in my ears? What then is this lowing of cattle? But Saul answered, well, the soldiers brought them back from the Amalekites. They spared them, the best of the sheep and the cattle, to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. But we totally destroyed the rest. We did exactly what you said. It was them. They kind of brought back a little bit, but what's the big deal? Samuel has had enough. And that's exactly what he says. Enough, Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And Saul, in his pride and his delusion, tell me. Samuel says, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king. You're blaming it on them. Are you not responsible? And he sent you on a mission, saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? And here's where we see Saul's delusion. He says, but I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites, and I brought back their king to shame him. Like I said, the soldiers took the sheep and the cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And Samuel replies, Saul, you don't get it. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Saul, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Saul, rebellion, which is what you've done, is like the sin of divination. It's like witchcraft, Saul. Saul, arrogance, which is what you have, is like the evil of idolatry. You've set yourself up as your own God, as your own king. And because of that, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Saul's self-deception ruined him. And here's where I would invite you to make a promise that I so wish that Saul had made. This is promise number 3. I will not lie to myself or blame others, even if I look like a fool. I'm not going to lie to myself. I'm not going to believe that I said something that I didn't say. I'm not going to believe that I did something I didn't do. I'm not going to believe that it was one way when it was really another way. I'm surely not going to put the blame on someone else. I'm going to take responsibility for my own actions, even if it makes me look like a fool. And here's where I would invite you to do something that if Saul had done would have changed history. Beware of your narrative. And you're sitting there thinking, what narrative? What's my narrative? This is what your narrative is. Your narrative is the story you tell yourself to get what you want, even when it's not the truth. And we all have that story that's constantly playing. Well, yeah, I know they said this, but it's really better this way, and so really, I'm going to do this. And you get what you want. I'm the best at selling myself on all of my bad decisions. And you too are the best at selling yourself. No, it really should be this way, and I know they said that, but I'm going to do this. The story you tell yourself to get what you want is your narrative, and you've got to beware it. Beware of your narrative. And the way that you can do that is by making 3 promises. The first, I will not fear the consequences of obeying God more than the consequences of not being liked. I will not value being in control more than I value being in relationship. And I will not lie to myself or blame others, even if I look like a fool. The story of Saul is the story of what happens when God gives us the king that we think we want. And your story, if you believe your own narrative, is this. You just insert yourself there, king you. It's the story of what happens, of the outcome and the result and the regret when God gives you the king that you think that you want. And so we come back now to Pilate standing before Jesus, and he's asking the most important question. Pilate asked Jesus, he says, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus corrects him, and he says this, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. I'm not a human king. Pilate feels like he's got him. He says, you are a king then. Jesus says, you say that I'm a king. If that's my crime, you say it, let it be. I'm a king. But Pilate, In fact, the reason that I was born and came into the world was to testify to the truth. Not to the narrative that they've created, but to the truth. I mean, here, this is Jesus saying the reason. This is the moment. The whole reason Jesus came into the world was for this moment, on trial before the whole world, and for us 2,000 years later reading about it. This is the moment. I'm testifying to the truth. And then Jesus says this. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Everyone on the side of truth obeys me. Everyone on the side of truth forgets their own narrative and listens to me. Everyone on the side of truth realizes that I am the King, the one that brings true freedom and true peace. And so the question for me this morning, the question for you is, what side are you on? No, really. What side are you really on? Because everyone on the side of the truth listens to Jesus, and he's invited us not just be a servant in his kingdom, but to be a brother, to follow him, to do what he says, to become like him in every way. What side are you on? Thankfully, God rescued us from Saul, and he sent a new king. And it's a king who was born in Bethlehem, who became the father of Jesus many generations later. And it's there where we'll pick up next week. Will you pray with me? Lord, I thank you for this story. I regret that the Israelites had to learn it the hard way, but I just thank you that we have the story and we don't have to learn it the hard way. That you can be our king now and that we can submit to you. And I pray that you will allow us to do that. That every single day, whenever we find the crown on top of our head, that we can take it. We can cast it down before you, Lord. Thank you so much for Jesus, our one true King, whose resurrection lives within us. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.